Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible by the Week. This week we are diving into Job again, and we're going to be finishing up Job, and there was much rejoicing. Yay! We're starting at Job chapter 35, and we're going to finish up Job, and then we're going to move into a pivotal point in Bible history, starting with Genesis chapter 12. So I didn't get any particular questions or comments this week that I needed to remark on. So let's just go and dive in. When last we left Job, he, you might remember, unbeknownst to him, had been accused by Satan of only loving God because God gave him stuff. In other words, because he was spoiled. And God was on the side of Job. He said, no, he's a righteous guy. And so he gave Satan, kind of inexplicably, the power to assault Job, to kill his children and take all of his wealth, and then even to give him this terrible disease, these terrible boils. And Job had three good friends who came and sat with him for a week and didn't say anything, just sat in his grief with him, which was great. But then they had to open their mouths. And what they argued was what many people argue when we're suffering, which is you must have done something to deserve this. And Job doesn't argue that he's perfect, but he does complain that he didn't do anything to deserve this, which we know to be true, but Job's friends won't believe it. They believe in karma. They believe that because God is a just God, that the people who are close to God, who do the right thing, will be treated well in this life, and that if you're not being treated well, you must have done something to deserve it. And this is, of course, something that people still often believe. Now, they argue about this for a long time, like 33 chapters in Job. Job and his friends go back and forth. And then at the end of last week's reading, a younger man, Elihu, who's been listening to this whole debate, he speaks up. He says, I was quiet because you're my elders, but now I've got to talk because you guys you haven't nailed Job on this yet, and I'm the guy who can do it. And he, starting in chapter 35, he rebukes Job for complaining about God. And he praises God as the one who corrects us, making the argument that we should view our suffering as chastisement from God, as something that will accomplish the improvement of our character. It doesn't mean that the affliction itself is good, but God can bring good out of it. Now, this, of course, we believe as Christians. Paul tells us that in all things, God is able to bring good out of it, but that's not the same thing as saying that God makes us suffer in order to bring good out of it. The fact is there's suffering in this world because it's a broken world. Now, this is not the conclusion that Elihu gets to. He praises God's majesty. He asserts that we don't understand God because he's so far above us. And this, it turns out, is the closest to the reality, to our understanding of God. So in chapter 38, finally, God speaks up, but he doesn't do as we would expect. He doesn't explain himself or defend himself to Job. Instead, he asks the questions. He asks Job, where were you when I created creation? And he goes on and on. Where were you when I did this? Where were you when I did that? And he's making the point that he's the creator. He's the one who knows everything. And Job is not the creator, and he doesn't know nearly as much. In other words, you and I don't have the right to question God because even though he gave us intelligence and we're made in the image of God, that's not to say that we're on the same intellectual playing field that God is. And so God does this, and Job realizes what he's done, and he says, I'm going to cover my mouth now, meaning I'm going to shut up. And to make sure Job understands how little he knows, God goes on. And he talks about some interesting things here. He talks about two creatures that, because there's no direct translation for these words out of the Hebrew, they just get transliterated into English. And one of them is behemoth, which you might have heard the term used in English of a really large animal. And this is a large animal. It's a kind of semi-aquatic vegetarian, but it's an extremely dangerous creature, whatever it is. So the closest thing we have now that people have assigned this to would be a hippo, because you may know that hippos are actually the most dangerous animal in Africa. You would think it was a lion or a tiger or something like that. It's not. It's hippos. They actually kill more people. And that's in chapter 40. In 41, he describes another one called Leviathan, which is even stranger to us. It has armor, scales, and it breathes fire. In other words, it comes from this ancient belief in dragons, and we don't know how to assign that with any creature. It doesn't really match any creature we have today. The closest would be maybe a crocodile, by the way it's described, but it's possible that this is an image that's being used of Lotan, which was a kind of Persian, Babylonian, ancient Sumerian animal that was described as having 7 heads, and it really personified evil and might. And God argues that he has overcome this creature, whatever it is. Now, there's a similar creature described at the end of the Bible in Revelation with 7 heads that personifies all evil. So this is not completely out of the range of possibility for the Bible, but we just don't know. We don't know what creatures are being described, so they're just kind of left with the names Behemoth and Leviathan. Maybe in human memory there was still memory of dinosaurs roaming the earth. We just don't know. So whatever these creatures are, they personify evil, and as mighty as they are compared to human beings, God is mightier, and that's really the point. And so at the end of this, 41, Job confesses that he said too much, and he repents. He turns back to God immediately. And then the Lord rebukes Job's friends, the 3 older friends, and vindicates Job. He tells the friends they don't know what they're doing, and they have to make sacrifices, expensive sacrifices to God to cover up their guilt, which is interesting because they were accusing Job of being guilty. And then significantly at the end of this book, Job is their mediator. That is, Job goes before God, prays to his friends, and they are saved from their sin. And after this, as a postscript, the Lord blesses Job. He restores him, gives him twice as much as what he's lost, including another 10 children. His 3 daughters are named, and it's said that they were the most beautiful in the land. So if you ever ran into the lodge organization Job's Daughters, that's why they picked that name, because they were these astoundingly beautiful daughters who also were given an inheritance with their brothers, which is exceptional for ancient times. So, and Job's given an extremely long life. This is part of the reason why this book clearly dates back to way, way early, before even the patriarchal period, because of the incredible long life that Job had. That was the tendency of people in ancient prehistory. So, does Job ever explain why bad things happen to good people? Well, Job himself never knows, and the answer seems to be we don't know it all. And we have to, but here's what we do know. We do know that God can vindicate us, and that we can trust God, that he is both incredibly just and incredibly loving. So, if you have questions about that, we probably need to talk face to face about that. I want to go on to Genesis, though, because we pick up at this great turning point in history. Up to this point, since the fall in the garden, things are continuing to spiral downward, that even after Noah is rescued from the flood, nonetheless, humankind keeps spiraling down into sin, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So in chapter 12, we've had the genealogy traced from Noah to Abram. And in chapter 12, Abram receives a call from God. Abram is the exception. He's a righteous person who doesn't believe in the gods of where he lives, current day Iraq. He doesn't believe in that. He believes in the true God, the one God. And because of this, Abram is called by God to move away from this. God's going to start over with him. And he's given 3 promises right off the bat. And these are incredibly important to keep track of. The first promise is that he's going to make Abram a great nation. And this is significant because Abram has no children, and he's getting up there in years. The second promise I mean, getting up there in years from our perspective. From his perspective, they were still in the realm of people having their first children in their 60s and 70s. Um, but he's going to have become a great nation. He's going to have a great name. And notice that this is in contrast. This is chapter 12 in Genesis, in contrast to the Tower of Babel, because the thing about the people of Babel was that they were trying to make a name for themselves. They were trying to glorify themselves. God is going to glorify Abram. And the third part of this promise is that he's going to be a blessing to all nations, that his descendants will be a blessing to all nations. So, this is incredibly significant. We're going to see this covenant reaffirmed. By the way, what's the difference between a covenant and a contract? Well, a contract is made between two people who have equal value that they're giving to each other. One person is paying a workman, and the workman is going to give them work that's equivalent in value to that payment. But a covenant is between two people who are unequal. So God is the great one, the king, and he's making a covenant with Abram. And you notice it's an unconditional covenant. Abram doesn't do anything to earn this covenant, but God is going to bless him with these things. And he simply trusts that God is giving him these things. That's a covenant. It's an unequal kind of arrangement. So that's the promise of this covenant. Abram moves with his father Terah, and they get as far as Haran, which is, I think, in Syria nowadays. And in other words, they've moved west, and he moves with his nephew Lot and his wife Sarai, and they move there. And then his father dies, so they continue on and they move to Canaan, the land of Canaan, which is the land that God is going to be giving to Abram. But Abram hasn't learned to trust God yet. He still uses his own devices. So when there's a famine in the land, they move down to Egypt. He doesn't consult God about it, even though God was the one who directed him to move to Canaan, which I always think is fun because God tells him, load up your everything you belong in a U-Haul, head west, and I'll tell you when to stop. Right? You wonder how much he had to talk Sarai into that. But he doesn't consult God about moving down to Egypt. That's just where there happens to be grain, the Nile Delta, and so on. And when he gets to Egypt, he's worried because Sarai is a very attractive woman, and as is the way of the day, kings were in the habit of stealing people's attractive wives. And so he tells Sarai to tell everyone that she's actually his sister. Now, she's his half sister, so it's a half truth and a half lie. And his reasoning is that if people think that Sarai's his sister, then they won't kill Abram in order to be able to marry her. They'll try to curry favor with Abram. And yet, the Pharaoh does, in fact, take Sarai to his palace to take her, but becomes afflicted. And that is God's way of revealing to the Pharaoh that, hey, something's not right here. And he asks Abram, what have you done here? Is she really your sister? No, she's my wife. And so he actually gives gift to Abram. They go out of town back up to Canaan. God is still blessing Abram, not because he deserves it, right? But he's trying to teach him. Now, when they get back into Canaan, Abram and Lot have both become very wealthy through their moving. They have these tremendous herds. Wealth was measured for most people in terms of the number of animals you had. And they had so many animals and so many servants tending the animals that they couldn't graze their animals in the same place. And so they get to this area, and Abram gives Lot his choice of which way to go. They have to move apart to have grazing land. Lot goes down to the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah because the land there, the grass is richer, is greener, and Abram gets the hill country. The problem is that Sodom and Gomorrah are notoriously wicked places, full of wicked people, I should say. And Lot is actually fighting on the side of Sodom when he gets captured in a raid, in a war, and taken away. And Abram is powerful enough that he gathers all of his servants. They go after Lot. They defeat the kidnappers and bring Lot back. And they've plundered their enemies. And when he gets back to this area, which is, by the way, around where Jerusalem is going to be, it's the hill country of Judea, this mysterious figure appears named Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is a Hebrew name that means the king, Melchi, of righteousness, Zedek, the king of Zedek, or righteousness, who is the king of Salem. Salem is the name of Jerusalem before the Jebusites lived there. And he mysteriously appears, and he's called a great high priest, and Abram gives him a tithe of the plunder. And you gave a tithe. If you were the lesser, you gave to someone greater. And much is made in the letter to the Hebrews about this, because there's this mysterious figure who just appears on the scene. He's the king of righteousness. Abraham worships him in a sense, gives him a tithe of the plunder, and yet it's never explained who he is or where he came from. And here's the thing: this is seen by the author of the Hebrews as a foreshadowing of the true God, if not a pre-incarnation of God, in that God is the ultimate king of righteousness, and he's greater than Abraham, and Abraham in effect worships him and sees him as his great high priest before there's an established priesthood. So again, this incredibly mysterious figure, the king of righteousness, appears and disappears. After this, chapter 15 in Genesis, Abraham's still childless. It's been quite a while, but he's promised by God again that his children will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And pivotal verse here: Abram believed the Lord, and it is credited to him as righteousness. And this is used in the New Testament by Paul especially to point out in Romans that Abram, it wasn't by his obedience to God's laws that he was declared righteous. It was credited to him. A credit is not something you earn. It's an act of grace on the part of whoever gives you that credit. God credits it to him as righteousness. And all Abram did was believed God, that God would give him, this childless couple, as many descendants as the stars in the sky. In effect, he was believing in his future and the future of the Messiah, who would be the fulfillment of this blessing to all nations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 10 years later, Sarai is getting impatient. And for the second time, they try to shortcut God. They tried to work it out on their own by moving to Egypt and having Sarai declare that she's Abram's sister rather than counting on God to defend them. And now Sarai reasons, well, maybe God didn't mean what he said. Maybe we'll have this child through my maidservant. This was a common practice, a surrogate mother. And apparently Abram, it wasn't too hard to talk him into taking this maidservant into the tent and impregnating her. And sure enough, Hagar, the name of the maidservant, gets pregnant. And then there's a problem, because as soon as she has this child, Sarai is jealous, right? Even though it was her idea, and she treats Hagar poorly, so that Hagar has to run away, runs for her own life. Now, interestingly enough, even though they've disobeyed God's promise, the Lord speaks to Hagar out in the desert where she's fled, and talks her into going back, and promises that he will bless her, protect her and the child, that Ishmael also will be the father of many nations, not the one that God has promised to Abraham, but nonetheless, even though Ishmael and Abraham's future descendants will be at odds with each other, nonetheless, God will bless them. In other words, he's on the side of those who are downtrodden. And it's interesting because you hear this in the song El Shaddai, if you've ever heard that song. To the outcast on her knees, you were the God who really sees. That's talking about Hagar. And in fact, that's, God, the God who hears me is a term that she uses for this place where God met her. So she returns. Abram's now 99 years old, still childless, and God recommits to him, renews this covenant, and changes his name from Abram, exalted father, which was already ironic. He changes his name to Abraham, the father of many, and changes Sarai's name to Sarah. We don't actually know what the significance was of that change, other than it means something like princess. And again, she's going to be the progenitor of this great race of people. And Abram is told, as a sign of the covenant, to circumcise all of the children that are 8 days old or older in his house. This is after he's believed, after he's been given this covenant. He doesn't earn the covenant through circumcision, but circumcision is a sign of the covenant. And it's in effect saying, you know, if I don't abide by this covenant, God, go all the way. Or another way of putting it is, through the vessel of procreation, I am reminded that God is going to create a great nation for me. Again, it's a sign of this promise to create a great nation, and it's going to be part of the descendants of Abraham ever after. There were other nations that did circumcision, but this was a special circumcision because it had God's word attached to it. So, Abraham does this. He circumcises all the males in his household that are 8 days old and older. And then these three mysterious strangers show up. Again, mystery. Mysterious because they show up. Abram is living in Canaan, basically camping out in a tent. And they show up, and he goes all out. Even though it's the middle of the day, you would expect that it's very hot. He entertains these strangers. He has a calf slaughtered to prepare a meal for them, has Sarai, knead some bread, gets some milk for them to drink. He refreshes these strangers and shows them the greatest of hospitality. And they tell him that he's going to have a child within a year. And Sarai, who's hiding, listening to this conversation from the tent, she laughs. And as a result, they tell her that through Abram, that the child should be called Isaac, which means laughter, because this is God's sense of humor, I guess. And then he promises that everyone will be blessed through this birth. And Abram, along the way, discovers that one of these three strangers is actually the Lord. Again, the pre-incarnate Christ. That is, before Jesus was born, God appears in the flesh to Abraham now. And interestingly enough, these two others that were with the Lord are going down to Sodom to destroy it, because it's this notoriously wicked place. And there's nobody there who worships the true God. They are just a cancer on the face of the earth. But Abram's nephew Lot lives there. And so Abram gets into this bargaining session with God, where he says, oh, but what if there are 50 righteous people? Would you destroy them too? And God says, no, if there's 50 righteous people, I'll save the town. Well, what if there's only 40? Would you destroy the town for the lack of 10? And God says, no, I wouldn't do that. He bargains him down to 10. If there are even 10 righteous people, God won't destroy the city. Well, the angels get to Sodom, where Lot is living, and they're out in the public square, where typically people would either spend the night, or the laws of hospitality are that someone would take them in for the night. But instead, the men of Sodom want to rape the angels. Lot sees this, and he hurriedly brings these strangers into his house. He's not as righteous as Abraham, but he is way better than the other people in Sodom. And I say not as great as Abram, because what he does is he offers his virgin daughters to the men outside his house. I can just imagine them. Thanks, Dad. They are going to play revenge on Lot later. Just point that out. But the men don't want his daughters. They want these two attractive young men who are angels. And so the angels warn Lot that Sodom is going to be destroyed, that he should grab his daughters, and he grabs his wife, and they flee the city, sure enough, just as the Lord rains fire down to destroy Sodom. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't let go of the lesser things for something better, even if God instructs us to. Lot's wife turns around and looks back, what they've been warned not to do, and so she is insulted, turned into a pillar of salt. My joke is that she's going to be pilloried ever after, because she turned back, and as a result of that, she doesn't make it out alive. Now, Lot and his daughters end up holing up in a cave, and And of course, they're terrified, they're traumatized. So they don't have much interaction. And yet the daughters are of age to have children. So they end up uh, getting their father super drunk, and they each get impregnated by him. And until they're pregnant, he doesn't know what's happened. And the result is that this is an enemy, another enemy of Israel down the road, the Moabites that are born out of this incest, is the Moabites and the Ammonites. So um, Abraham, again, with a local king, Abimelech, he hasn't learned to trust God either. He passes Sarai off as his sister, but God keeps Abimelech, who interestingly is a Canaanite, but he seems to be a righteous and man with integrity. He's not, doesn't touch her. Abraham intercedes. And she's sent back. Again, God lets Abimelech know, you don't want to touch this woman. She's not who Abram says she is. Uh, anyway, Sarai does get pregnant. Isaac is born, and he's circumcised on the eighth day. This when Abram is 100 years old. Um, and again, there's this jealousy with Hagar and Ishmael, and they end up being sent away, but they're protected by God. Now, mysteriously, we get to this story that's really tough, I think, and that is that God suddenly, out of the blue, calls on Abraham to make a human sacrifice, which is unheard of for the God of Israel. But these were times where human sacrifice was still common, and we're told by the author of Hebrews that Abraham reasoned that God wouldn't do this unless he would resurrect Isaac, because God has promised that he will bless all nations through this child, through Isaac. In other words, Abraham is learning. But to show Abram what he's learned, to give him a test of faith, he's told that he should sacrifice Isaac at this place God is going to show him. You notice that Abraham gets up the very next morning, maybe before Sarah is awake, and loads everything up and gets out of town and takes Isaac to do this. He doesn't wait to get permission from Sarah. There's no way that he would have, I'm sure. Uh, they go to this place, and they leave the servants behind. And so Isaac and Abraham are carrying these things for the sacrifice up the mountain. And Isaac, who's now, I think, 14 years old, says, Dad, aren't we forgetting something? The sacrifice? And Abraham says to him, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. And this becomes a catchphrase for the Hebrews, especially since they get up to the top of the mountain, and somehow Isaac agrees to this. Abraham takes the knife, he ties Isaac up, he puts him on the wood, he takes the knife, he's about to slaughter him, and a voice comes from heaven that says, Abraham, don't do it. Don't do it. I know now that you trust me. And what's interesting is Abraham immediately after that discovers a ram caught by its horns in a thicket, and that becomes the sacrifice. So what he said was true, that on the mountain of the Lord, it was provided. What's also incredibly interesting about this is that this mountain, Moriah, it's thought later became called Mount Zion and was the mountain on which God's Son was sacrificed for us. In other words, this is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Also interesting in this story that doesn't come out in English, but if you have a Bible where the Lord is sometimes all in caps, Lord, in caps, that means that the actual word is Yahweh, which is the Hebrew name for God, his personal name that he would later give to Moses and the children of Israel to call him by his name. It's believed that it comes from the Hebrew, which means he is. In other words, the God who really exists compared to all these fake gods, these idols. Yahweh is the name of God. In this story, the mysterious God who orders Abraham to sacrifice his son is just referred to as El or Elohim, meaning God or the gods. But as soon as he shows mercy to Abraham, as soon as he rescues Isaac, then you see the name Yahweh appear in this story. In other words, when God is mysterious and we don't understand him, we just refer to him as God. But when we see his mercy, that's when we say, oh, that's the God I know. That's the God that has revealed himself to us. That's the God who actually exists, not the mysterious God that we think is so unjust, but the God who actually is merciful, who will someday sacrifice himself for us. It's an incredible story with these layers of meaning in it. So it may seem really cruel and incomprehensible at first, but it's really an important story in the history of the Israelites. Oh, that is my alarm saying that it's been a half an hour. I just want to point out one other thing. This story doesn't end there. Abram sends his servant to arrange a marriage for his son Isaac. That's chapter 24, and that's where we are going to end it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this week's readings, and I look forward to discussing them with you next week.